responsibility, which not surprisingly created a firestorm within the CSR community. Many bloggers, activists, business leaders wrote oppositions or rebuttals to his initial argument. Last week, Fenton hosted a debate, and it was a fascinating debate. I moderated it. It included Professor, also Krista Freeland from Thomson Reuters, who was equally as pessimistic about the ability of, quote, corporate responsibility or sustainability to really make a difference in the world. We also had Matthew Bishop from The Economist, George Kell, head of UN Global Compact. We had Dave Stangus from Campbell Soup, and Bob Corcoran from GE Foundation. Also Aaron Kramer from BSR was joining us. It was streamed out live to about 1,000 people. I think more people have seen it since. And picking up on what Gil said, because Gil, I looked at you and I want to ask you about 10 questions, and so I will give you an opportunity to interject. But I just wanted to give everybody just a quick sense, if you don't mind, Sandy, of a couple of things we heard, because they are 100% applicable to what Gil just said. In his opening statements, I asked the professor, can you please, given the fact that, look, we've just experienced a disaster in the Gulf, a meltdown on Wall Street, we've had some of the highest temperatures, unemployment rates, and now poverty rates in this country on record. Why now? Why, wage this debate now, and what were some of the key points? One of the first statements he made was that sustainability, or corporate responsibility, is not a popularity contest. Gil opened his talk today talking to you about some key statistics. 90% of people, corporate leaders, think sustainability is serious, not enough, think they're doing enough about it. And when he said that, as moderator, I wasn't allowed to comment too much, but here is why I disagree with the professor, and I would invite other people to interject their opinion too. It is a popularity contest. In fact, that's exactly what it is. Because if you are a corporation and you see that a critical mass of your stakeholders, your investors, your consumers, your employees, people outside your corporation are demanding change, and you ignore or fail to deliver on that change, it creates tremendous problems. And an example of how this just occurred to the world's largest chocolate company, Hershey Chocolate, is really compelling. 2 weeks ago, Hershey Chocolate issued its first corporate responsibility report. The responsibility report was filled with the rhetoric that Professor Karnani and also Krista Freeland from Thomson Reuters kept talking about during the panel. They didn't go far enough. 10 days ago, or actually 6 days ago, 3 nonprofits, the Global Exchange, Green America, several others, got together and they produced the real CSR report for Hershey's Chocolate, which is now circulating on the web. If you do a Google search for the real Hershey's CSR report, you'll see, and it's fascinating, because they told us the story that the corporation was unwilling or unable to tell. They talked about problems in the supply chain, they talked about the lack of transparency, and they also talked about job losses, worker abuses, and then they noted in the last section, desired outcomes. Here's what we believe Hershey should do. That created far more buzz and publicity than the initial CSR report. And it's just, the takeaway from this is what Gil talks about, the reasons why there's a business case, and if you don't have your head around it, it might be too late. But then there's another issue, which is the global demand for more integrity in business. And this is obviously not just in the United States, obviously in Europe, China, all over the world. And so I just feel like that is an important issue that people need to be, wrapping their heads around. And I know Sachi will probably be addressing that in a little bit more detail. But I feel like people need to focus on the popularity contest aspect of this, because it speaks to unmet needs and it speaks to a surge in demand. And if you are to compete in global markets, you need to be not only aware of market changes, but shifts in attitude, preference, and behavior. And I think that's a real issue that we're going to
I also think, so how many in the room are just want to get a pulse. How many people in the room are responsible for corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility as your job? And how many folks here are in the communications industry? Okay. So most of you come from your responsibility is how to integrate corporate social responsibility, corporate responsibility into the core business. What I look at every day is communications, because I agree with Christine. Not only is it popularity, let's use that word, but transparency, which gets to, it's a communications problem that we're having, in addition to a strategy problem. And I would argue that as a follow-on to Gil's comments earlier, not only is it a business strategy, but it's what are we telling people, how are we telling them, and what do they want to hear? And in this world of instant on the web, there is no such thing now as you get to dictate and your own story. Your own story is in the hands of millions upon millions of advocates and critics. And you have to understand that and use them in terms of spreading your story. But the very first case that you have to make is what's your business case for sustainability, and then and corporate social responsibility, which I think corporate social responsibility and sustainability go hand in hand, in both an environmental approach and a social justice approach for your company in the world have to be communicated effectively, synergistically. So I think we can talk about that. One of the things that I kind of wanted to open as a provocative point of view is, Gil mentioned, can you make a business case for sustainability? What if you were asked to make a business case for enriching your own life? I'm going to raise the provocative question, and I think, Gil, you really moved us to it, we're not asking for a business case, we're asking for make the case. And if we continually use the lens of only business to respond to what a business's responsibility is in the world, because the world is asking these pressures that Christine is talking about, the kinds of expectations that a myriad of stakeholders are having on a corporation go beyond the financial footprint, the business case, and they're asking you to have both a community case and an environmental case, and all of those things need to pay attention to. And I would posit how we talk about them. We lack the right kind of language if we're trying to squish all of this strategy and objective into business language every time. That's part of the framework that's hampering us from both accelerating our own movement to becoming a sustainable corporation, but it's also hampering our ability to build advocates. So,
I agree. The language is really a problem. In fact, we spent most of the debate last week arguing about semantics. I just wrote a piece for Christian Science Monitor talking about how ridiculous that was. But, the professor made an excellent point. He said, what do we mean by corporate responsibility? Every company says corporate responsibility is at the core of our business. And his point to the panel was, well, what does that mean? And most companies, many companies, still can't answer that question. And in many companies, that rhetoric isn't in sync with the way they make money. If you go to the Goldman Sachs website and you click on philosophy, you'll look at 12 principles, and ethics and corporate responsibility are up there, listed as these are fundamental drivers. Now, if you look at the way the company makes money and, addresses or you could say manipulates the markets, but that's just me. But, if you look at the business model and the postures it takes publicly, and also the nonprofit cause-related work it does, you could make the argument that those are antithetical. On the other hand, they are doing some fabulous things, with their sustainability index and so forth. But that's where we give ammunition to the quote other side to say, corporate responsibility is really meaningless. Now, one issue that's important is you can think, do companies have a social responsibility, or do they have a fiduciary responsibility? Well, to Gil's point, a social responsibility is a fiduciary responsibility, because it's about responding to pressing conditions that affect the needs of your shareholders. His example on the electronics market is fabulous. And you could use that same example and that same mindset to look at the automotive industry. If it were 1998 and you are the head of GE, and, you know, you could say, well, we don't really think that fuel, and there were very weak fuel efficiency standards in the United States. You could say, well, we're not going to evolve, we're going to be very slow in terms of building more efficient cars, because that's not what the population demands. They like the big trucks that get 10 miles per gallon, so we're just going to keep farming those out to the best of our abilities. But, you know, 8 years later, there are major problems, and some of them really did center back on the fact that other countries and other manufacturers took the lead. Also, there are complex labor issues and things like that that hampered the U.S. automotive industry. But the point is that if you look at fiduciary duty means being aware of the big picture. And what's happened in this country, and because of our stock market with publicly traded companies, is people mistake fiduciary duty for maximization of short-term profits, when sustainability really works if you implement it properly and you communicate it properly over the long term. You are positioning a corporation, and that's why the business case, we keep having these discussions, because you can't show necessarily a direct correlation between a company's investment, near-term investment in sustainability, and an immediate surge in profits, or an immediate, you can see lower costs at first, but the profits come a little bit later, and then once your stock is affected, again, it's a little bit later. So that's this short-term mentality. I think that's the conversation we need to have, not whether or not there's a business case. The question should be, through what lens should we make these business decisions, and also what are our expectations in terms of timing?
And I think that's right, Christine. I think that if we expand the filter with which we make decisions to include social and environmental impacts, and what we're asking executives to do is enlarge the framework within which they make decisions about business strategy, business operations, business prioritization, and use some of the same principles that they use for making R&D, for some of the decisions you might make around R&D in terms of product development. If you allow the same long horizon and a return for a environmental impact that you were putting forth for the company, it would change the way in which you gauge its impact on the business, because you do allow it to have a longer term horizon. Interestingly, Procter & Gamble made a significant announcement in 2009 Clinton Global Initiative, which is happening right now. They're back this year to report on their progress. This is an example of a company that understands its role in the community. Its purpose is making people's lives better, and through their products, of course. What they've said is, though, we're also a powerful communicator in the marketplace. And their own customer research indicates that 70% of their customers don't see environmental, sustainability, social as a driver for purchase. But they've said, regardless, we are going to use the power of our brand communications. We touch billions of consumers a day, and we're going to provide them with education on how to reduce their own energy use, reduce their own water use, separate from how they use our products, separate from whether or not they are actually buying our products. We're going to take our brand communications prowess and put it toward making the world less reliant on energy, less of a waste producer, less of a water user, because that's the right thing to do, even though our own data show that our customers don't actually think they want this right now. So I think it's calibrating your judgment for what you see you can do and make a difference in the world as a company, and listening to what the forces in the market are saying. So I think that's really interesting. They've allowed they invented brand management, let's face it, and so they're using, that's so core and congruent to their brand promise that they're going to actually use brand advertising to make the world better. So I think that's an example of a communication strategy that's very consistent with brand strategy.
And with respect to the communication strategy, and I'd like to hear from some of you, and also if anybody has questions or wants to probe, I would totally welcome that. But one of the things we found in research is that the companies that tell the truth about where they really are, and even communicate a problem, we weren't able to achieve this objective because this is what happened, or we realize we have massive problems, and Mattel just did this. We have massive problems in our supply chain, and we've had problems with lead and X, Y, and Z, and here's what we're willing to do. That disarms people. It has a great power. Telling the truth has a great power. It shifts, it really does shift dynamics between a corporation and its stakeholders. And it also helps a company get on a trajectory where after you've really come to grips with the reality, you can then decide how to strategically and intelligently, in a way that makes sense for your shareholders particularly, set out to try to close some of those gaps. And I feel like that's the most important element to any corporate responsibility-driven communication, is that authenticity.
Yeah, I have a question. I come at it from a communications perspective. So I think the big issue that, from a communications perspective, is the narrative.
Yeah.
You know, it's called CSR, corporate responsibility. You know, citizenship because it involves employees. And corporate responsibility, or CSR, is one of these topics that is so passionate to people that I think the passion, when you try to migrate that over to the business, is kind of lost in translation. And so, you know, it's like I've been fortunate enough, you know, like when I was at Dell, to recycle 2 tons of computer waste with Goodwill in Muskegon, in Michigan. When I was at FedEx, I drove a refurbished hybrid FedEx delivery truck cross country to California to go into service. And every step of the way, there was an issue. All right, so 2 tons of waste out of you know, the central part of Michigan, and someone had a problem with it. You know, driving a FedEx truck across the country to put you know, already a 750,000-mile vehicle that now has a new tranny and everything, so that it can do another 700,000 in a very fuel-efficient way. Someone had a problem with driving it across country. And so these problems, this passion kind of, you know, hurts that narrative. So how is it from, you know, maybe like from a PRSA standpoint, where it kind of put some ethics around how the profession works, or, you know, if you call it PR, you know what it's PR, I mean, it could be media relations, internal, but it's PR. Like, so how does the profession get to the point where it's corporate responsibility, citizenship, and then you can sell that, you know, to the executive level and more importantly to shareholders?
Well, here's what I think. We have a ethical framework. Thanks for the question, because I think you hit on something that I actually have a very personal passion, and I'm going to just step on my soapbox here for a minute. We have a framework for reporting the financial dimension of a corporation that is long and well established. IR, Investor Relations, guides the requirements. The SEC has certain parameters. And we have an entire industry devoted to measuring, counting, and talking about the financial decisions that a company might make for every piece of its operations and its strategy decisions. I mean, think about it. We go from bookkeepers to CPAs to accountants to huge, you know, top 4 accounting firms and management consultants, and there's a rhythm and a vernacular and a language that we all absolutely understand. And we have been maniacally, singularly focused many times in describing a company and its place in the world just within that framework, as if that's the only framework that matters when you talk about a company, is what kinds of decisions did it make, what trade-offs did it make, and we always do it in the context of market challenges. And we give guidance, so we give a year long, and then we have quarterly updates, and we all understand the rhythm of this. Imagine if we had the same, we simply just expanded that and said, we're also going to be talking about our environmental impacts and our social impacts alongside our financial impacts. And we were reporting on all 3 of those things in tandem, in context with each other, in context of market challenges, in context with guidance, and because we don't ever hit financial nirvana. There isn't some mecca that a company arrives, we dust our hands and say, oh, we're done, we are now a financially viable company. It's always changing, migrating, and based on strategic decisions of the company. The same thing is true of sustainability, environmental and social. We don't end up at this place that we are now a sustainable company. It is always going to be responding to market challenges. And if we can get that broad framework, then we can stop arguing about this much waste versus that much waste. I mean, the financial community might have an opinion about why you counted this versus that, why your PE ratio is this versus that, why those kinds of short-term returns were chosen versus this long-term view. And reasonable people can argue about financial decisions within a framework. What we're missing is the framework that sets all that. So from a communications and a narrative standpoint, what I espouse is, let's create this language. I call it a language of goodness. It could be the language of the environment and social dimension that we are now with the same understanding and framework of the way we report on financials. So it's going to take time for us to create the guidance and the study. Certainly schools like the Presidio and other management and that are teaching MBA students and business students to begin articulating a business's progress in this multifaceted dimension. I think that's where it's going to have to go in terms of creating a narrative.
To add to that, I mean, I think the most important thing is to realize that any corporate responsibility or sustainability related communications, whether it's about your experience driving a fuel-efficient FedEx truck across the country or whatever it is, it needs to be a conversation. This is a conversation. And if you just talk at people in a corporate blog about here's what we're doing and here's why, that's a very different dynamic, or you issue a press release. It's a very different dynamic than if you actually engaged with people. And I know it takes so much effort to do that, but it's so worth it, because you end up, you're just saying we're listening, and then you respond directly. Social media is so wonderful, and then it gives us a free tool to be able to do that. And I feel like that is what creates momentum and belief in what a company is doing, and it gives you the opportunity to show there's humans behind this. You know, I'm just like you, and I really think there's so many great examples of how that's changed a dynamic communications-wise for a company, and I really feel like that's a key.
I'd just like to add one more thing. The thing that's different about the social and environmental impacts that a business has is the level of curiosity, interest, and deep wanting information is so much bigger. So yes, we can compare it to the financial dimensions of a corporation, which is the framework within which we typically communicate a business's state in the world. And the market for that information is small and somewhat esoteric because it's people who might be investing in that company. It's the people who care about your social and environmental activities is pretty much the rest of the world, because your impact in the world, not just your financial impact, but your social and environmental impacts, matter to stakeholders that go far beyond shareholders. And that's why getting this right, getting it not regulated, but getting it framed so that it's ethical and clear is going to be really important. And it's why the web is so powerful, because your messages about what you're doing and the way in which they impact this myriad of communities just spreads instantly.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. Being involved in our corporate reporting to some extent, hearing what you stated about the Hershey's report, which I haven't seen yet, what are your views about the formal corporate report as a vehicle for communication today? Do we have to do something different with it? Is it been superseded somehow, by social media? It seems to me that it's very hard to be authentic in that sort of format, and I'm sure first reporters like Hershey's have a difficult time finding the right tone.
Yeah, they definitely have a hard time finding the right tone. I have mixed feelings about the CSR report. On the one hand, it does instill a discipline to start to track things like Gil's talking about. You can't manage what you don't measure, and the CSR report is an effective tool for encouraging companies to manage variables that otherwise might go unmeasured, and therefore they may miss opportunities and actually bleed unnecessary costs and face unnecessary risks. On the other hand, it is a fact that most of the stakeholders that you care about, not everybody reads a CSR report. That's the way to say it, okay? I get lots of CSR reports sent to me, and I probably only read 10 out of a pile of 100, because frankly you don't have time, and they're very, very long. And so I know that there is an industry that really propagates, let's keep spending $250,000 to $500,000 to create these things because they're expensive. They take a lot of time and energy. On the other hand, I feel like I would love to see that information wrapped into an annual.
I would too.
And I would also love to see companies get out there using video and cutting edge media to talk about, look, these are the real issues. Procter & Gamble is doing a live announcement, I think it's today or tomorrow.
Monday.
But Monday, and Joel McElroy from GreenBiz is gonna host it. But it's, that's the kind of thing that people wanna know. They wanna know, tell us, put an interesting piece of communications out there. It could just be a webcast, or it could be a video where you're engaging people and inviting them in to ask questions and push back on certain issues. Make it a conversation. This is what we want to do. This is what we promised to do. This is what we have done. Here's what we need to do better, and how do we get there? And make that a conversation. I feel like that just, again, it changes dynamics, A, like I already said, but B, good ideas come from anywhere. And people inside a company, it could come from, at Interface Carpet, I remember the best sustainability idea initially after Ray Anderson made his decision to put the company on a new trajectory, came from a sales guy who actually said, okay, here's my idea. Instead of sound carpets, let's lease them. And then another guy in a manufacturing facility said, well, instead of discarding, extra carpet that after cutting to measure, let's recycle that. So those ideas can bubble up from anywhere, and it's an opportunity that you'll miss if you don't make that communication interactive. You need to engage people.
And I also think that the CSR report is the formal reporting that happens in the same way that an annual report does. And I agree with you, it'll be great when those two documents are merged into one and a company's reporting on all those trajectories annually. But I would suggest that you embed your social and environmental progress in all of the corporate communications. This should just become part of the message that you tell to the world. It's revealing to the world and all of your stakeholders the other dimensions to your business that matter. You're not just reporting on what we're doing from a fiduciary responsibility, or the corporate message and the corporate speak becomes larger, and it allows you to talk about the things that matter to your employees, to your customers, to your communities, and we give companies permission to talk about that. So I would argue, let's weave those environmental and social messages through your marketing messages, through your corporate communications, through your employee communications, through your suppliers. Weave it through, it should be part of the fabric of your story.
But the most important thing is finding the story.
Right.
What is the story? What is it that you're, like Bill was saying, that you're here to do? How is the company taking its greatest strengths, what it's tremendous at doing, and channeling those strengths towards meeting unmet needs or to responding to potential future opportunities? Tell that story. Storytelling is so important, and that's what gives people something to respond to. Otherwise, it's just words on a page.
Questions? What's some of your biggest challenges as sustainability and CSR? Tell us what, let's get a conversation going about, you mentioned
It's about culture change.
culture change.
That's the biggest hurdle, is managing that culture change between different dynamics of different organizations. Because depending on what your organization is, I'm in food, I've got myriads of different kinds of people that are employed, that we contract with, and then we also have a huge risk along our supply chain. So it's very, very difficult to manage the shift in thought, the shift with being open, transparent, and the shift being out there, especially if we're traditional, been around for a while. Like they're used to being like, just doing their thing, doing the right thing, and doing it for years. That's what I keep hearing. So right now, it's leveraging that kind of conversation. Like, look, well, okay, so you say you've been doing this for years, and you say, we've always done the right thing. Okay, so let's talk about it.
Right.
And then that's when they go, where's the return on investment to talk about it? And then they're like, oh. So then you go back to trying to figure out and give examples that are out there. And like, I like what Dave Stangus is doing in Campbell's and what P&G is doing. But as far as using all the media outlets and getting out there and telling a story, if you recommend doing it on top of CSR report at the same time, or not doing CSR report at all? I know it's just kind of, The CSR report to me does seem limiting, it does seem flat, it does seem kind of archaic at this point, because people really want to know the truth, and they really want to feel like they're a part of your story, especially the younger generation. So then you have that cultural shift. And then the whole lack of consumers really purchasing greener products or more socially responsible products, that's lacking too. So it's very difficult right now to manage why we should shift the culture, why it's necessary, and making sure you bring in all the different kinds of viewpoints.
I believe that the shift is underway. I think Bill gave us a compelling argument that if we don't shift our business practices, we won't all be here. We're depleting resources faster than, just way too fast. So the shift is happening. The market's asking for it. Customers are asking for it. Employees are asking for it. Mike spoke to that in his opening comments about the young folks that they interview are looking to work for a company that is environmentally and socially activated. So the market pressures are there. The question is, how does the company respond to that, and how quickly do they integrate that? So culture shift is challenging. One of the things that I'm working with a food company right now, where we all know that the food industry, the food ag industry, is under tremendous transformation, and they're grappling with risks, opportunities, and trying to make some decisions around where should they focus. And our advice always is at this sort of North Star, pick the singular area where you're going to have an impact as the focusing energy within the company, so that all the decisions can move toward that. It doesn't mean you don't do other things. It means that grounds you in that core purpose. And it should be tied to the reason you were in business to begin with. And then the communications can resonate with how you're working on that across the entire communications. So yes, on top of a CSR is a very limiting device to communicate the complexity of problems that are being addressed and the heart that's behind it. If there's one thing I could leave you with, is giving yourself permission. All of us need to give business permission to speak from the heart and not just the head. And that's a shift in language, and that's part of that culture shift. Yes, we haven't talked like that before. We've been doing it, but we're not talking about it. But if we all start talking about it, it gives everybody else permission to talk about it. And pretty soon we're accelerating change, because we're all talking about the ways in which we've made social issues, environmental pressures, part of our priorities as a company.
I would give you 2 pieces of advice for what they're worth, and you can take them or leave them. The first piece of advice would be, don't put the cart before the horse, okay? Because strategy within the company needs to lead execution, and execution needs to lead communication, in that order, for it to be effective. Second, start small. So you're dealing with, okay, we've got a massive culture change underfoot, but I need to, in order to even accomplish this goal, I need to work with X supplier. So start there and work with X supplier, and just focus on the small things that you know you can achieve first.
Would you focus on your suppliers, or would you focus mostly on what you know would be a controversial issue?
It depends on the company and the variables involved. I would say, I don't know enough about that to give you an intelligent response, but I would say, start with something you know you can achieve, and then go to the harder issues, because you need that momentum and that traction. And we've seen that happen in so many companies. McDonald's, frankly, its turnaround now that is on the cover of Fast Company this month was started by a guy, Gil, Matt Slaterhausen. He was just a McDonald's owner. He was a franchise owner in Sweden. And this is, 10, 15 years ago, and he decided, and he came to the United States and he saw how McDonald's stores were being run here, and he said, this is ridiculous, this is terrible. They totally moved away from the focus on family. The stores are filthy. And in Sweden, he was already actually very advanced in terms of supplying lettuce and tomatoes from local suppliers, recycling the oil that was used. He was doing all kinds of things. So he wrote a letter, it was a resignation letter actually, to the head of McDonald's here in the States saying, A, I resign, B, here are my suggestions for what you should do. And management was like, we don't accept your resignation and come to Chicago because we want to talk to you. And that's partly how a lot of the change happened, it trickled up. You absolutely need senior management's commitment in order for anything to work, period. But those little, starting small is it's just how most companies get started. They don't make a grand decision and then everything switches because they have supply chains. It's much more complex than that. I mean, I wish the code were that easy, but to your example, it's clearly not. Yes.
I was wondering, I worked with a large client who had a very strong brand with their annual report and wanted to do their first sustainability report and got it really tied up with, do we have a new brand or is it consistent with the annual report? And suddenly these branding people and communications people got involved. And I just was curious if you had any advice for people that are first starting around that issue. Sort of how does it look? What's your key message?
How does it look? Okay, so the question is, you have an annual report, but you've got people that are starting a new initiative around a corporate responsibility report. I'm sorry, maybe I didn't understand it. Yeah.
If you're launching your first sustainability report,
Okay.
how do you see that fitting into the larger brand? Do you recommend people come up with a new look, feel brand, or do you think it should be part of their?
I think it should be part of what the corporation does. And I think anything corporate responsibility-wise or sustainability-wise a company does should be, again, part of the core business. And because that's what makes it sustainable. In Gill's definition of sustainability, a key variable is financial sustainability. If it's not financially sustainable, it's not going to work. So in corporate responsibility reports, where companies get backlash, where people ask questions and where it's less effective, or when they just talk about philanthropic issues that are outside of really the nuts and bolts of what a company does and how it makes money. Really, looking at the nuts and bolts of what a company does and how it makes money, how it makes things, how it sells them. That's where to start. And I feel like that's where some of the good stories are. And what it's doing externally, and I'm not discounting philanthropy, it's very important, it's lovely, but that's what people really want to hear. So don't be afraid to kind of focus there and make it the brand. Make it, you need to be your brand talking. I would say don't create if BP Beyond Petroleum is a good example of this, a green image and then behind the image investments that are waning, and the investments move in a different direction and business decisions are driven elsewhere. That's where trouble occurs.
The most innovative, sustainable brands are the ones that have consistency and that there isn't this arm's length view of their corporate social responsibility and environmental impacts. Those are very close to the brand. In fact, they are representative of the brand. So the drive to have these separate campaigns and separate names and colors and logos, I would, it's confusing enough to keep all your products connected to your brand, let alone initiatives. And these aren't initiatives. This is who you are as a company. If it's an initiative that requires a campaign name, you've got it wrong.
We have time for maybe one more comment before we take a break. One over here.
Hi, quick question. With respect to traditional methods that businesses organize and execute, I'm very interested why we don't see at many conferences more folks from the HR side of the equation who can help design the right incentives for people to, with respect to operations, that might drive the right behavior. And I'm just sort of wondering if you could comment on that. Of course, in order to have the right incentives, you've got to have some goals. Of course, I guess not surprising that you often find goals are always even numbers, 5%, 10%. No one ever says we're going to do something by 21.7% because they don't have that sort of granularity in problem addressments. But I wonder if you could speak to the issue of how do you design or how do you sort of communicate to folks the need for the right incentives with respect to operations.
I think that we're talking about a massive shift inside every dimension of a corporation, and HR and organizational development is also a piece that needs to be transformed. But to Christine's point earlier, it starts with a strategy, then it gets to execution, then it gets to goal setting and internal. And I think the day is coming when an employee's goal setting will include not just financial metrics, but it will include environmental and social metrics. And wouldn't it be great if the kinds of volunteering programs that Mike mentioned this morning, out cleaning up rivers, what if it were installing their own solar panels on in developing countries or schools? I mean, really connecting your community outreach plus your volunteering plus your philanthropy plus your community and social responsibility and your environmental outcomes. If all those things are integrated in a beautiful way, then you can embed it, begin weaving it, because it doesn't become something you do after the fact. After you've paid all the bills, we're going to write a check for the mess that we created in the way that we operate. We're going to not operate messy to begin with. And that's part of our employees' metrics. So I think it's coming. I think this transformation is coming in all of the departments in the company. We certainly see it in internal communications and the need to create campaigns that engage employees as that type of communications. And I hope HR metrics follow.
And just to add to that, it's an excellent question because engagement is the engine that makes it go. If we don't have employee engagement, if we don't have engagement from even the outside world, it is very challenging to make anything happen in a company. And I know a different speaker is going to be talking about engagement, so I won't say so much about that, but I will refer you to a book. It just came out. It's called CSR for HR. It's by Elaine Cohen, and she addresses exactly some of the issues that you just brought up. I feel like that's probably the most important piece of the equation in terms of an effective execution anyway.
All right, well, can we hear a round of applause for our panel?